You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We're coming to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to Rethreading Madness.
When I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do, when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Michael Rembis. Did I say that right, Michael?
Yes.
And it's Mike.
Yeah. Yes, I published by Michael, but it's Mike, yes.
Mike is an American historian. He is a scholar specializing in histories of disability, institutionalization, and madness. And I love, as you probably know, I love the term madness. We all have our own words that we like to use to reclaim what has been really taken and used and defined by others. And I assume you like the term madness because you've used it. Do you want to explain to people what the term madness means to you?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for having me, Bernadine, and for giving me a chance to speak with you and your audience today. I really appreciate it. I'm very grateful. And sure, yeah, I can say more about the term madness. There's several reasons why I use it. I'll start with the most boring, I think. I am a historian. I have a PhD. I'm a professor in the field that I've come to kind of specialize in is called the history of madness. And historians use that term as a kind of big sort of capacious or roomy term, that can be used to represent a number of different kind of states of being, emotional states, mental and emotional experiences over centuries. It's big enough that it can be used to explore change over time, and it also, I think, gets away from those kind of very historically specific diagnostic terms that have been developed over the centuries. And so historians use it, and as I said, that might be the most boring reason. The other reason is because I consider myself part of the disability rights movement, the global disability rights movement, and an ally to the Mad People's movement. I study the history of the movements. I am allies with folks who identify as mad and who have participated in various Mad Pride celebrations over the years, and I recognize that folks have reclaimed this term and really empowered themselves through it, use it as a way of talking about experiences that in ways that aren't medicalized, and just really highlighting their own voices and experiences, which is what I do. We started saying I do the history of madness, and I do that, and the history of psychiatry and institutions and institutionalized people. I also like to describe that as a mad people's history, because I really study the history from below, from the bottom, from people's lived experiences, from folks who have been institutionalized and diagnosed and had interventions in their lives and on their bodies in various ways. So that's why I use the term madness very kind of happily, and.
If I was to turn this around and ask you to define what madness is, what might you say?
Well, I think I'm a historian, so I think I would begin by saying that madness, ideas about madness, definitions of it change over time. They've changed over the centuries in the Western world, which is what I study from antiquity to the present. There have always been mad people considered mad. Those terms have changed over the years, insane, insanity, lunatic, medical diagnoses, all sorts of stuff. But so I think it's a term that's been used for a very long time to represent behaviors that are non-normative, behaviors that are kind of outside the boundaries of what is established and really kind of bolstered and supported as, quote, normal. And I also think that, it's a term that's used to also represent embodied experiences. And by that, I mean that often these are real, felt, lived experiences that, we need to think about madness beyond the level of representation, beyond, just kind of metaphor and the way people are thought of. I think it's often used to describe real embodied states of being. So hearing voices or thinking about certain things or feeling feelings, in your body in various ways that might be considered um, not normal. And so I think that's the way I define it, as a term that changes over time and is used to describe both embodied states or embodied ways of being and also the way society perceives folks who are, who engage in behavior that is considered outside the bounds of quote normal behavior.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we know that psychiatry and psychology has been we try and as a society sort of mash it into the idea that it's altruistic and helping, but at the core of it, it seems to be what is there at the core is about control. It's about social control. Is that
Yeah,
still true?
I would agree with that. I think, and again, I approach this both as a historian and as somebody who is living in the present and part of these movements. And I've seen that through my own experiences and through conversations with folks and the research that I do that, it is in many ways about social control. I think people can find relief in those systems in some ways or through those systems by connecting with others with similar lived experiences or who identify in similar ways. And so, we've over the course of the 20th century developed various kind of what might be called peer support networks and other forms of providing support for folks. And those systems of knowledge and power, psychology, psychiatry, can be used to find those, but I don't know that they're necessarily necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a big debate, and I won't bore your listeners with the big kind of historical debate, but there was a debate for a long time between two kind of schools of thought that, psychiatry and asylums were institutions of social control. And then there was another whole group of people who thought, no, they were created with the best of intentions. And the idea was to provide relief and to quote, cure folks. And I think with my work and with other folks who do similar work, we've shown that it's somewhere kind of in between those two extremes, that asylums and psychiatric power have been challenged from the very beginning, especially by people who are targeted for intervention. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but that it is a form of social control, but it can also provide relief to some folks.
To some. When you're looking at as a woman, I have this history as a woman that comes with me wherever I go, and that is, the idea that men were allowed to have their women locked up because they didn't clean the house the way they wanted or didn't obey the way they wanted, and it doesn't. You look at it from that perspective, and it's no longer about relief or cure, regardless of your best of intentions. That is basically taking away somebody's rights when they weren't crazy or mad to begin with.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I absolutely agree that that is part of the experience of folks. And in my book, I look at Elizabeth Packard a little bit. I kind of don't focus a lot on her because other historians have. So I focus on other women who
Mm-hmm.
were often involuntarily, forcibly committed. And my book is this most recent book is 1830 to 1950. So I'm exploring the early history of this in the United States.
Right.
And I look at women and I look at those gender politics and you're absolutely right there. In the historical evidence and in more contemporary times, I think gender is incredibly important when we think about commitment, we think about diagnosis, we think about relationships within families in the community and other places. And yeah, many women were forcibly committed by husbands, by physicians, by judges and others who, you know, um, labeled them insane or mad or diagnosed them that way and committed them, incarcerated them in these institutional spaces. Yeah.
You've written a book called Writing Mad Lives in the Age of the Asylum. a fascinating book. This is the one that you were talking about that goes from 1830 to 1950?
Yes, yeah, that is the one. That it is my my most recent book, and it um, I call it writing mad lives because I look at folks who were committed to asylums in the United States, throughout the United States, from between 1830 and 1950, and I look at um, many of them left various forms of writing behind. They printed pamphlets, they produced longer kind of book length manuscripts, they wrote letters, they kept diaries and journals, they contributed to newspapers and magazines, they testified before investigative committees in state legislatures, and their transcripts left behind from their testimony, which was under oath, and they did a lot of public speaking. And so I look at those folks and their experiences and what they were saying about madness, not only their own lived experiences, but about madness more generally, about asylums, about the place of the asylum, in this case, in the United States. Some of them wanted to abolish it, even in the 19th century. Many wanted to reform it. And so I tell this story of them and their lives and the experiences that they had with madness and with the people in their lives, with commitment, with often being committed against their will and detained against their will. Their experiences with working to get themselves released or freed from the institution. Their experiences, moving back into the community and trying to build a life for themselves again after they were committed, and living with the kind of the stigma of diagnosis and asylum commitment. And it's really, I mean, it's a beautiful story in many ways, of friendships that were formed, networks that were formed, reform movements that were formed. It's also a harrowing history of
Mhm.
the abuses they that they made public, that they made part of a public conversation, the abuses, the neglect, the violence of commitment itself, but also of the, what they experienced and witnessed when they were in these asylums, these institutions. So
Yeah, and
um,
I think that that's partly what people don't understand. It's really nice to be on the outside and say, "Oh, no, no, they're there to help people. They're trying to fix them. They're trying to make it better." But when you actually hear the stories, it's really hard to square those two ideas together, because we're talking about people who went through horrifying, harrowing, like you said, abuse and torture, and under the guise of treatment.
yeah, no, I agree completely with that statement. And I tell those stories from their perspective, and I think the book is really important for a number of reasons, but especially for that. I think, I mean, it's been called sort of fundamental rethinking of the time period. It's been described as fundamentally shifting the conversation, a kind of a really important and necessary new interpretation of this past. And it's because I've explored it through the experiences of mad people. I've written a mad people's history, and used the what they said in public, what they wrote, what they printed in public, to really show all those different facets of the asylum and the experience of commitment. And one of those is abuse, is neglect, is unwanted interventions into their bodies. There's accounts of under oath before the New York State Legislature, in fact, women testifying to being sexually assaulted in the asylum. And so, and all of those things are recounted, and it's a painful past. But it's one we have to grapple with, one we have to deal with. And it's one that hasn't been explored to this point because, historians before me were, with a few exceptions, were interested more in what I call doctors' diagnoses and uh,
Mm.
and prescriptions and pills, and hadn't really, they dismissed this whole huge kind of body of evidence, and they dismissed mad people, mad informants, as unreliable. And
Mhm.
but I mean, I think through this work I've shown that there are hundreds and hundreds of people who are telling similar stories, and so we have to, I think we have to believe them. We have to listen to them. We have to take them seriously.
Yeah, I mean, mental health consumers have not been traditionally listened to, even as massive stakeholders to what treatment does. They haven't been, literally, this is the only business you can walk into, and your customer, the feedback they have for you is meaningless. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
whether or not your customer, your person you're servicing of any kind likes what you do or not. And of course, I live in BC, and our Mental Health Act is considered one of the most barbaric, and it gets even worse on some level because here you can be picked up and committed into a psych ward fairly easy. And as soon as that happens, you literally lose criminals have more human rights than people with mental health challenges. And so you don't get to talk to your wife, you can't phone a lawyer, if you can be treated, you can be treated. There's this idea that, once you are committed, you have deemed to have consented. So not that you have, just that you have been deemed to have consented to any treatment the psychiatrist wants to apply. So they can apply ECT, they can apply psychosurgery, which are lobotomies. They can keep you locked up, doing and that treatment to you, chemical restraints, antipsychotics for 3 weeks before you are given a hearing. And so by the time you get to the hearing part, the likelihood that you are able to speak up on your own behalf, never mind find a lawyer, is very small. So it's a scary place we live in.
Yeah, it is scary. And I would add too that there's a history there that hasn't been explored. And a recent reader of the book emailed me, and I was really touched and moved by their email, but they said that they felt like they have finally been seen, and they described it, as very empathetic storytelling and history writing. And I was so touched by that because it's precisely what I wanted to do with the book. I mean, I show that the systems of intervention that you're talking about, the laws, which are state laws mostly, but there are federal laws also in the states, are, they're similar, and they have a long history. And there's this history of struggle and resistance among mad people, against those systems that dates back, to the early 19th century in the States, and even further in some
Yes.
places. And, I would say too that, consumers and users, have a difficult time being listened to, as you mentioned. And I think survivors and anti-psychiatry folks have an even more difficult time of being listened to. And so the book I'm working on right now is going to write that history from 1950 to the
Good.
present. Yeah, from
That's
1950
good.
to the present. So,
Yeah. We just need to take a little break, Mike, but we'll be right back, folks, so don't go away.
Hi, folks, this is Steve Ferguson, your 21st century schizoid man, and I'm coming to you on behalf of Prog Rock Alley. We are hitting up your airwaves every Tuesday night at 7 o'clock p.m., running that whole hour, bringing you the very best of progressive rock. That includes art rock, math rock, experimental, alternative, a little bit of everything, and sometimes I just sneak in a favorite song of mine just for the hell of it, because I can. Every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. If you want it, I got it. Just name it, I'll play it. That's Prog Rock Alley on CFRO 100.5 FM.
You're listening to Rewriting Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Michael Rembis. So, Mike, you are an author. You've written this book. When did it get published?
it was published in December of 2024.
Okay.
Yeah, by Oxford University Press. It's an academic book. I'm a scholar, I'm a historian, but I've written it in a very accessible way. I mean, I had in mind, sort of all of those mad folks throughout the world. That's kind of who I wrote the book for, and so it's written in a very, I think, accessible way.
So your book centers sort of on the writings of people who've been labeled mad, who've experienced the psychiatric systems out there, rather than the doctors or the institutions who sort of have created the field, have created the institutions, have created the idea of treatment and what that should look like. What happens when we shift that focus when we change the historical lens from looking in from what we've been told by the profession to looking out from the perspective of people who've lived through it, what is the primary things that change?
Well, I think the most important thing is, um, one, maybe not most, but certainly one of the really important things is that, and I mentioned this in the book too, but we really see folks as human beings. We really, people who experienced commitment, people who experienced diagnosis, release and reentry, they become, I mean, they always were, but we consider them, more deeply as human beings, as complex human beings, as more than a diagnosis, more than a patient,
Mm-hmm.
or even more than a victim. You know, um, we see them as human beings, as fathers and sisters and mothers and brothers and workers and all sorts of things. So I think that is really, really important. And I also think that it really helps to show, and this is a fundamental shift in the history, more so in the kind of the profession, the academic field, but we see that these institutional spaces, these asylums were contested spaces from the very beginning. For a long, long time, since the 1960s, since kind of the post-World War II, historians and others kind of, well, I mentioned this earlier, but they kind of, argued that these were curative spaces, that they were healing spaces, they were restorative spaces, they were created with the best of intentions, or there were others who argued that they were just social institutions of social control. And we never really got past that. And I think this book helps us to move beyond that, to show that they were really contested spaces from the very beginning. The people who were targeted for institutionalization, the people who were confined in those spaces, engaged in dialogue, in conversation with the people in the institution, but also in larger public conversations. And they really shaped that system. They didn't succeed in abolishing them, but they did succeed in reforming the asylum system in many ways. And they really they challenged psychiatric authority from the very beginning. It's not a recent development. It has a long history.
One of the things that has, of course, hit the world news that comes from BC is what happened at Tumbler Ridge. Here we had probably our worst mass shooting in a school. We don't have them often, Michael. There, maybe I can think of maybe 5 in all the history that I know of, which so very, very different than the United States, but certainly the biggest one in Canada. And the a young woman who committed this crime was transgendered. And we have people jumping on that as an idea about why it happened, but then other people using that as an offshoot, a springboard to talk about as mental illness. And we don't normally use the term mental illness on this program or disorder, because I just find we don't need to, but it has come up in the context of this story. And one of the things as it's come up made me realize just how much and how widespread it is that people use the term and use the idea of mental illness as a sort of there's a broad overlapping thing that they can just sort of throw at a topic, and it sort of somehow for them explains the whole thing, and they don't have to think about it anymore. But of course, the notion that our mental health challenges can be hidden under one sticker or one label really does sort of push the whole notion of how much stigma is out there in our world, that it can be thrown out and just left there as if it explains everything, when it really doesn't. People who have mental health challenges are less likely to hurt other people than many, many other people. And so this is one of the things that has come up recently here in BC that's made me realize we really do need to redefine this a little better for folks.
Yeah, and I've written about this, not this particular incident because it's so recent, but about violence and mental health and the ways in which it gets used in the media and in public spaces, public discourse, and other places as a shorthand and as a way to kind of dismiss any larger critiques or conversations about sort of the ways in which society is structured. I've, as I said, I've talked about this in an article. It's an academic article. It's called "The Murder of Malcolm Tate." It can be found on my academia page. But and I'm kind of responding to a call by Mad Studies folks, this larger interdisciplinary field that I work in, to really explore violence in more complex ways and to move beyond this kind of idea that put forth by some folks that mad folks, mentally ill folks are like sort of perpetrators of violence, and then the other kind of extreme where, or not extreme, but the other end of that conversation where folks say that they're more often the victims of violence. I think the latter is absolutely true. It's been, shown in many, many ways. But what I would add to that conversation is that these kind of spectacular ways of these spectacular portrayals of violence and madness capture media attention. They capture the attention of politicians and others, but they obscure larger conversations about the everyday violence that mad people live with,
Mm.
about the violence of diagnosis, about the violence of commitment, about the violence of forced drugging, about violence they face in the community, in their families, and elsewhere, and about the kind of violent structures that we create in our societies that that are rooted in longer histories of colonialism and slavery and the eradication of indigenous peoples. These are all violences that folks are living with. And so I think we need to really engage in a more complex conversation or a more nuanced conversation around this issue of violence. And of course, we need to stop using violence as a way to not talk about what is really at stake and what is really kind of happening with folks when they act out in various ways.
Yeah, it's kind of I thoroughly believe that we live in a society that and I'm female, so mine is very subjective to the notion of being female, that our social fabric relies on the sexual assault of women. It might sound really extreme, but when you start looking at how, just the stuff around Epstein that's coming out and how that was just allowed to continue in our society, and you take that broader lens and take it back just to the person within a family who's harming children, and how the systems around those people, those perpetrators, simply seem to fall away or look away or enable or do something else. It really is quite fascinating to see. And currently, one of the things that I do a lot of volunteer work with people who've been harmed by therapists, and some of those therapists are no different than a child molester. And so you think that walking into the mental health industry, that you're going to talk about this thing that we have 40 some years of recognizing how molesters groom, exploit, and then use and then discard their victims. And you can absolutely show how that is being reenacted by therapists who are bad therapists, but by therapists within a system that then does everything that society did back when we were dealing with child molesters to begin with. They look away, they talk it over, they blame the victim, they say we're not looking at that, we're not talking. So it's really hard to see a mental health industry that is in fact enabling and excusing people who are perpetrating profound trauma on their clients. Of course, this goes to psychiatric survivors and the sexual assaults that you were talking about. It all sort of goes hand in hand. And I sometimes wonder where all of that is going to change. What have you found in terms of, you talked about a movement? Is this where's the movement going? Is it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, those are really important things to consider, and I think we need to, and I think folks in the Mad People's Movement, the disability justice movement, are challenging what they would call, the violence structures that we live within, the violence of, cisgendered, heterosexist, racist, capitalist, settler colonial violence, that is um, shaping our lives, shaping our encounters with these systems. I mean, it is taking a lot of work to undo those systems, and I think folks are doing everything they can at the structural level, at the sort of cultural and ideological level through various justice movements, to kind of change those systems. But you're right to say that I think it's deeply embedded in many areas, of our lives, and we have to we have to remain vigilant. We have to kind of constantly, fight against it, guard against it, and work to change it.
Yeah, it's really hard to change it when you are I'm not a therapist. When you're not a therapist speaking to a mental health industry to say you need to stop. I mean, it really, you're under that place of you are not listened to. It's back to exactly what you were talking about before, where people are being harmed and they're not being necessarily heard about how that happens. And so I'm not really sure what the mechanism is that's going to make the mental health industry actually pay attention. Do you?
Yeah, no, it's a difficult question. But it's what, at least in part, motivates me to do the history
Mhm.
that I do. I know it's a very long-term process, but that's really what motivates me at my core. One of the things that motivates me at my core to do the history that I do, we need to show, and kind of to establish in the minds of the psi industries and the psi complex that mad folks, users, consumers, survivors, however folks identify, psychosocially disabled, folks are they're reliable informants. They need to be heard and listened to, and their words and their work needs to be taken seriously, especially by the psi industries.
Yeah, I hear that, and I hear you saying that, and my head shakes. That I just don't know how we're going to jump that chasm that gets, that gets the mental health industry to take seriously the mental health consumer, because we have so many centuries. I think it's centuries
Yeah.
of not listening, of not hearing, of believing that they know better than the rest of us about what is true for us, that they get to define that they get to diagnose that they get to create the parameters around how we get heard and what gets heard and how we have to act to be able to get heard, and all of those things that go into it.
Mhm. Yeah, I
So
think that's a very good, very valid, very important point. But I wouldn't want to leave this conversation feeling hopeless or defeated. I think that we
no,
need to
let's not do
continue.
that.
No, we need to continue to do the work. It's such important work, and we need to continue to do it.
And do you see change?
I have seen change. I think, we're living with now 40 years, um, of the DSM-3, which really transformed psychiatry and psychiatric diagnosis, the biologization, geneticization of psychiatry. But I think we're now starting to, sort of come out of that, perhaps. Kind of, I do see, and maybe it's just the people I associate with and the circles I move in, but I do see change happening. I especially because the DSM captures so many people in the neurodiversity
Mm,
movement. Many of folks in that, um, who identify as neurodivergent, also identify as mad. And so I think there's so many folks now that are falling under this kind of, or being captured under this psychiatric kind of net that, um, I think it's forcing change in some ways. I think it's incremental and it's
that's
slow, but
interesting.
I do think things are changing. I think just the fact that we're having these conversations and that they're increasing and that they're global is important. You know,
Yes. We just need to take a little break, Michael, but folks, don't go away. We're going to be right back.
Hey, this is Mark Kiliansky from Golden Shoals. You know, in a world where things are constantly fed to us through a screen, through an algorithm, independent radio offers music and playlists made by friends, neighbors, and humans. I love it so much, and I really want everybody to continue to enjoy that in these modern times. Forget Spotify, forget YouTube. Listen to Co-op Radio, 100.5 FM and coopradio.org.
I used to bend till my spine felt paper thin, smiling through the cracks, letting the hurt settle in. I carried every word like a weight on my chest, tried to be your answer, forgot I deserve rest. I chased approval like it was oxygen, held my breath just to feel chosen again. But every mirror screamed what I couldn't see. I was losing myself trying to be everything. I stitched my heart with broken thread, slept in rooms full of things unsaid. I loved so hard I disappeared, but tonight my voice is louder than my fear. I choose me when the world says I'm not enough. I choose me when the road gets steep and rough. I won't beg for a love that bleeds, I won't shrink just to fill your needs. I choose me. I choose me. Let the silence teach me how to stand. Learn my strength wasn't in someone's hands. Every scar is proof I survived the fall. I rose alone, but I rose through it all. I gave my light to shadows that couldn't stay. Set myself on fire just to keep them warm that way. But I'm done mistaking pain for truth, done paying debts for someone else's youth. I wipe the dust from my own name, stop calling heartbreak fate. If loving me makes me selfish tonight, then I will I choose me when the night won't end. I choose me when I break and mend. I won't fade just to keep the peace. I won't bleed for your relief. I choose stay. I choose me. So here I stand, no chains, no plea. No more running from the girl in me. I don't need saving, I don't need proof. My heart is mine, my truth is truth. And if loving me is my greatest fight, then I'll win it every single night. I choose me. I choose me.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I'm having this really great conversation with Michael Rembis, who is the author of Writing Mad Lives in the Age of the Asylum. He's a historian and scholar specializing in the histories of disability, institutionalization, and madness. And I didn't realize I was going to have such a great time talking to you, Michael. So thank you for this. One of the things that came up from the last segment that we were talking about is I had a conversation with, I think it was Dr. Colin Ross from Texas. And he's a person that specializes in dissociative identities. And we got onto the whole notion of pathologizing trauma, which is very prevalent in the DSM. And I talked to him, I asked him a question. It has rambled around in my head ever since about, if what we're doing is taking the normal responses to trauma and calling them crazy, isn't it about time we stop doing that and stop making them disorders or an illness or basically pathologizing them? And he pointed something out to me that I thought I would never have thought about it. What he said was, if we stop calling them disorders or stop calling them illnesses, then there will be no reason for insurance companies to cover somebody as seeing a psychiatrist or psychologist or counselor to work with them. What do you say to that? Is that true? Is that kind of how all of that goes down?
No offense to the good doctor, but I think that's a very simplistic and reductive answer. I think it doesn't even begin to answer the question. And in fact, I advocate for the complete opposite. I think there's so many things about mental health and madness and disability that we need to demedicalize. I think we need to support folks in ways that are not medical, and I think we can still have support. I think seeing things through a clinical or medical lens is not always, or in the case of disability, rehabilitative lens is not always the answer. And I think funding through those medicalized systems is not the answer. I believe in state support. I think we need to have the state support folks when they can't support themselves and each other. But I think that also needs to be decoupled from medicalization and the sort of clinicalizing of these experiences. I think we can find other ways, and we need to find other ways to support folks through different systems. And
will insurance companies support that? Because that was my answer to it was, well, then the system needs to change.
Well, and I think we need to find other funding mechanisms. I think we need to take insurance companies perhaps out of the mix. We need a social support fund, in some that can be managed some way to help folks when they need support. I know, we don't have nationalized healthcare in the States, and private insurance companies have they have way too much power to begin with. And so I think we need to find other ways to support folks, especially in moments of crisis. And we need to decriminalize, crisis and trauma. We need to find, and I think people should have medical support when they need it. I think they should be able to turn to it when they need it, if they need it. But I think that there are other ways that we can support people.
Mhm. The imbalance of power between the therapist and the client is humongous. It's one of the things we deal with all the time when we're talking about therapy harm. What do you've listened to and read and researched the stories and the accounts by psychiatric survivors coming forward in a multitude of ways and multitude of avenues. What do those accounts tell you about power, especially when it comes to involuntary commitment or treatment? And I know that they're in the past, but how did those accounts, do they still resonate today? Are they still issues that are happening today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are deep resonances with today, and I would say that, of course, power is not absolute, and I think that folks have power, and they exercise that power in various ways in different encounters with physicians and other so-called experts and asylum administrators and law enforcement and the judiciary and all these different things. I think that there are imbalances in power, certainly, but I don't think that that people are. I think people have power and agency within those situations, but sometimes it can be greatly constrained, and that becomes really problematic.
Mm-hmm. For listeners who have their own experiences with mental health challenges or institutionalization, what do you hope they take away from writing Mad Lives?
I hope, I mean, I mentioned an email that I received from a reader a few weeks ago.
Mm,
I hope that they see it the way that that person sees it. That person identifies as mad and as trans, and they said it was, an incredibly empathetic history, that they felt like they were being seen, for the first time. They felt like they had this kind of kin network that extended back over 100 years. They felt like they had a history that they could turn to situate their experiences, think about their experiences. I hope people take that away from the book. I hope that they relate to the folks in the book, and see that these institutions, these asylums in the psychiatric system have been a site of, as I said, a site of contestation from the beginning, a site of negotiation and conflict from the very beginning. And there was real harm that was done. Folks didn't always come out on top or get their way, but there's certainly been a struggle there from the very beginning for people to take agency over their own lives, to find their own lives and their own treatment in situations in which they were living. And I hope people take that away from the book. And I also hope that they recognize the power in telling our stories and not having them co-opted by
right.
physicians and by nonprofits and others who might use them in ways that we never intended to use them. But I do think
Mm-hmm.
that telling our stories is the most important thing we can do.
Absolutely. You mentioned the term community care. What does that mean?
Yeah, I thank you so much for bringing that up. I wanted to mention that within the context of this new book that I'm writing on, which is a Mad People's history, of kind of peer support and the Mad People's movement from the 1950s to the present, and that's part of a larger communities of care project that we're doing here in Buffalo, but we're also interviewing folks remotely through Zoom and other means. We're working with folks to co-create their own stories. Again, this importance of telling our stories. We were doing that through conversation, through transcribed conversations that folks, can participate in and contribute to from the beginning to the end through all the sort of different levels of transcription. We're doing it through writing, through focused writing groups, and through other forms of writing. We're doing it through arts-based storytelling. We're working to build a massive digital archive of people's stories, of the ways in which they've cared for and supported one another, often in the face of scarcity and threat and a lack of acceptance and a lack of belief among the larger society. And so we're building that archive, and it's also going to be there will also be a library and resource center that's part of this digital space that's going to be online. So,
Wow.
if folks want to reach out, they can, and we would be happy to work with them to tell their story.
And is there a criteria about who you are looking for?
Well, we are talking to folks who may or may not identify as mad or disabled, but have lived experiences or that might qualify as mad or disabled experiences or have been identified by other people in that way. And we're interested in talking to everyone, but especially folks who have been racialized or who may be trans or queer or poor or indigenous or kind of been marginalized in other ways in society. We're really, really interested in hearing from those folks, co-creating stories with those folks.
And do they have to be psych survivors? Because I certainly live with mental health challenges due to trauma. I would not consider myself a psych survivor because I've never been institutionalized.
Yeah, no, they don't have to be a survivor. Folks can identify as a survivor, consumer, user, disabled. They can identify using a diagnosis. They can not identify at all, but still, as I said, like we were interestingly finding in some communities that they don't use words like disabled or mad, but they do talk about things that we would consider to be sort of disability experiences or mad people's experience.
Right. And are you bringing people in from around the world, or is this just a USA based project?
Well, we're interviewing and we're having conversations and writing and art with folks locally in person in Western New York, but we're also doing this remotely through Zoom, so we can work with people all over the world. And through this program, we're also bringing in we're having artists in residence, we're having visiting speakers, visiting scholars, visiting fellows. So there's a lot of opportunity there to come to visit us in Buffalo as well. But also, I think there's a real robust system to do stuff remotely as well.
Right. Thank God we've learned how to do that, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So you have talked about your book, you've talked about some of your writings, you've talked about your next book, and you've talked about this program that you're putting on. Tell people where they can find this material.
Well, they can find it if folks Google my name, Michael Rembis, Rembis. My page at Buffalo, which needs to be updated, has all of that information. If people reach out to me through email, which is on that page, I will respond to them quickly. The community, if people could Google University at Buffalo Communities of Care and find that project, which the website, I should say, is very much under development. We're in year 3 of our first 3 years, but we're going to have another 3 years, so that the site itself is still under development, but people can get a sense there. So Communities of Care, University at Buffalo, Michael Rembis, and the book, Writing Mad Lives in the Age of the Asylum, is Amazon, anywhere books are sold, people can pick up a copy of that as well.
You have also written some other things. Are these look like essays or academic papers? Disability, a reference handbook, disabling domesticity. I said that very hard.
Those are all books that I've either authored or edited. Yeah, those are all. Yeah.
So people can look for more of your material, but the book, Writing Mad Lives, can be found on Amazon. For folks. So Michael, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I have enjoyed it. I didn't expect to have some of the conversation that we had, but I really have appreciated being able to have this conversation with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Bernadine, and thanks to all the listeners. I'm extremely grateful to be here. Very, very thankful to be able to speak with you today.
We don't actually have very many professionals on, so you're in a small group, rare group of folks. And but I have no doubt that this material that you are producing and have produced is going to be very valuable to people who want to understand what's going on in their own lives. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It's my honor, my pleasure.
And we'll be right back, folks.
Tanuyap, Quiget Yuans, Queens Na. Hi, everybody. My name is Quiget Yuans. I'm a member of the Squamish Nation and the Yagalanas clan of the Haida Nation. You're listening to Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We live, work, play, and broadcast from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
Through Tree Canada's National Greening Program, native tree seedlings are planted across Canada, creating a widespread impact. The planted trees provide habitat, prevent soil erosion, and reforest areas that have suffered tree loss due to pests, weather, etc. Tree Canada performs 1, 2, and 5-year assessments to ensure tree survival is similar to natural forests. To learn more or get involved, go to treecanada.ca.
You're listening to Rethreading Madness on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and that's our show. My thanks to Michael Rembis from the University at Buffalo for coming and chatting with me about the history of madness. If you're wanting to pick up his book, it's called Writing Mad Lives in the Age of the Asylum, and you can get it at Amazon. Music today was by Sherry Ulrich and C. And to you, our listeners, thank you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. You've just listened to Rethreading Madness, where we dare to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program, or want to share your story, or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. This is Bernadine Fox. We'll be back next week. Until then.
When I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do, when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through, just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright, don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, surely you don't have all of the facts. You could be just making it up. Why don't I ever think of that? It's some kind of magic in the words that you breathe, saying, baby, take it from me. It's alright, it's alright, don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Everything's gonna be alright. With anyone else, it's such a cliche, just words people say to be nice. Or someone